Good morning. We are at the end of the book of Job. Over the last couple days, finished the last half of the book. And it's always amazing to me as I read and get to the end of this book because we have many chapters where God is speaking directly to Job and his friends and basically answering Job's questions, sort of. If you remember through the book, Job was asking the reason why he was suffering. He didn't do anything wrong, and he didn't deserve this suffering in his life. And he wanted to know why God had allowed it. And if he could get to talk to God directly, he would be able to show himself righteous and explain it to God and say, God, what you're doing is incorrect. Well, the Lord, when he begins to answer Job, disagrees with Job's assessment. And his response is not to actually answer the question, why did he allow Job to suffer? But basically what he says is, I'm God. And that may sound like a terrible answer at first, but the more that we think about it and the more that we know the person of God, the more it makes sense. The answer to the question of suffering is something that mankind struggles with all the time. For centuries, people, especially people of faith, have tried to understand, why does God allow human suffering? And the truth of it is we don't understand his purposes in much of it. But we do have examples where he shows us the purpose, and that does give us some indication of what the heart of God is and how he uses suffering. The greatest example is always Jesus upon the cross. The great suffering of Jesus wrought for humanity salvation. So God not wasting that suffering, allowing it and using it for a good purpose. In Romans, we're told that God works all things for the good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So we have some idea that God is not numb to human suffering, but allows it and uses it to advance a good purpose that he has in mind. But it's so complicated that really, if God tried to explain it to us, I don't think we would really be able to understand it. So this is how he presents himself to Job, is basically saying, I'm God, and you can trust me. Now in chapter 40, those last couple chapters here, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Basically, Job, okay, you want to try to correct me? Go ahead, try to correct me. And Job, in the presence of God, answers, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. So in the presence of God, when before he was boasting that he would make his case, not just because the presence of God is awesome, is Job afraid to speak, but as God has presented himself in his glory and his wisdom and his understanding, Job comes to the conclusion that he really has nothing to say, that God knows what he's doing. And any time that we're going to try to correct him, we're always going to come out on the wrong end of it because he's so much greater and his thoughts are greater than our thoughts. In chapter 42, Job again speaks to the Lord and says, I know that you can do everything and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes sees you. Therefore I abhor myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. Job now goes on to say to the Lord, I know you can do everything, and whatever you want to do, you can do. No purpose of yours can be withheld. He said, I uttered things that I didn't understand. When I was saying all those things, I didn't really understand who you are and what it really meant to utter those words. He said, I'm seeing things and understanding now things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. He said, I used to just hear about you by the ear. I was just told about you. I heard stories about you. But now my eyes see you, and I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job says, now that he has a better understanding of God, he knows that he was wrong in trying to impugn God with evil. He says, what I actually see as I look into the glory of God is my own wickedness. And therefore, all I can do is repent. This idea of seeing God in his glory and understanding the great difference between the perfection of God and the imperfection of man is shown to us in other instances in the Bible. One of the most famous is when Isaiah is in the presence of the Lord. He said, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, right? And as he's looking at the Lord, he says, I found that I was a man of unclean lips, and I live around a people of unclean lips, that his sin became so apparent. Just like if you are looking at a piece of paper and it looks white to you, right? If you're next to red, you're next to black, you say that's just a white piece of paper. But then if you bring it out into the sun and you put it next to a bright white substance, perfectly white, no color at all, then you can look at what you had in your hand and you say, wow, I didn't realize how off-white this was, how much of a difference there was between the perfection of pure white and what I'm actually holding that I thought was white. And that happens when we come into the presence of God. We see what real perfection looks like, what glory looks like. And then we see ourselves. And we know, I can't stand in this presence and say anything except, I repent. You're right. I'm wrong. Your ways are better. My ways are nothing. And as he does that, the Lord speaks to Job. And it says in verse 10 of that chapter, the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. God rebuked his friends for giving him bad advice, his three friends. And he told them to make a sacrifice and come to Job, and Job would pray on their behalf. And when Job prayed for his friends, the Lord gave him twice as much as he had before. That in Job exercising God's will and bringing the petitions of his friends before God, acting as an intercessor on their behalf, seeking their forgiveness before God, that God also then restored Job. And look what he does. It says that he gives him twice as much as what he had before. It says that he blessed the later days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And in the land there were found no women so beautiful as the daughters of Job. And their father gave them inheritance among their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. After this suffering, God brings Job into a place of abundant blessing. This is not payback for Job. I made you suffer. Now I feel bad. I'm going to give you stuff. What this is the heart of God and his intention all the time for Job, to bless him and to care for him and to love him, because that's what the heart of God is. When he allows suffering in our life, he doesn't allow it on a whim, but he's going to do something good with it. And when that time has passed and the suffering is no longer required according to the will of God, God allows in our life abundant blessings because he is abundantly good. And he blesses Job so much that Job has now twice as much and a long life and all these other wonderful things. And there's a happy ending to Job's story. And I love a happy ending. It starts out with a story of Job falling into suffering, God being incited by Satan against Job to test him. But it ends with a happy ending. And if you ever read fairy tales, you'll know that so many stories end with the phrase, and they all lived happily ever after. And I don't think that ending is just a coincidence or just a way that writers have used to wrap up a story. I believe that there's something in that happy ending and our desire to see a happy ending and our expectation of a happy ending that's a reflection of the knowledge of God that he's imparted into the earth. That for those who will trust in him, God always is preparing a happy ending. We may see some of those things in this life, but ultimately all of us will experience in the next life as we come into the presence of God, saved by his Son. If we, like Job, humble ourselves and say, I have nothing to say in my own defense except I repent, I was wrong, you were right. And we throw ourselves on the mercy of God, God, in his great compassion, takes us and doesn't give us the justice we deserve, but bestows on us mercy without measure. And we are brought into the kingdom where there are pleasures evermore at his right hand in the presence of God, enjoying that wonderful fellowship with him forever and ever. I love a happy ending. I hope you do too. So I just want to leave you with this thought. When you trust in Jesus, when you trust God, you know that you have a happy ending waiting for you. And you can say at the end of your life, and we'll all live happily ever after. Have a great day.